So thanks Micheál, and thanks to Joe, and thanks to you for being here. It's wonderful to see biodiversity on the agenda for the summer school this year. So I'm a specialist in ecology, and as a scientist, sorry, do I need to adjust that? Yep. As a scientist, I'm painfully aware of the limits of my own knowledge. I can tell you in detail about the birth, mortality, and reproduction and growth of hundreds of plants and animal species, but this is just a drop in the ocean compared to the millions of species of plants, animals, fungi, bacteria that we share the planet with. So some of these millions of species hold fascinating and potentially very useful secrets, and perhaps some more cancer medicines to join the 70% of drugs used for cancer currently that are derived from or inspired by natural products, so coming from the natural world. Ireland itself is home to about 30,000 different species, and the number of species is one of the ways that we use to quantify biodiversity. So biodiversity itself is defined as the variety and variability of life on Earth, from the genetic diversity that makes everybody in this room unique. We are part of biodiversity, through to every individual animal, plant, fungus, bacteria is unique, through to the variability between very different kinds of species, from bacteria through to polar bears. So biodiversity is all of these levels of different variabilities and varieties of life. So throughout the Earth's history, we've seen the waxing and waning of different kinds of biodiversity, different life on the planet. And indeed in Ireland, we see the waxing and waning of different kinds of biodiversity. However, the biggest driver of change in biodiversity right now is the transformative effect of humans on our climate, land, freshwater and ocean systems. Now, Ireland declared a climate and biodiversity emergency in May this year. This is simply an acknowledgement of the scientific consensus on climate and biodiversity degradation that's been ongoing for decades and which has accelerated in the last couple of decades. The scientific consensus on biodiversity and biodiversity loss is presented in the reports from the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, and I had to practice saying that a lot of times today. Helpfully, it's also known as IPBES, so IPBES is a bit easier mouthful. The IPBES Global Assessment was also published in May this year, and it's a report that was commissioned by 130 different governments around the world, and it was approved line by line by them in plenary in May this year. So it's a big deal, and it's consensus. The IPBES report consolidates and synthesizes scientific findings on biodiversity and ecosystem services. It's the equivalent of the IPCC reports on climate change. Hundreds of scientists were involved in putting together the IPBES reports based on thousands and thousands of scientific studies on biodiversity and ecosystem services that have taken place over the past decades. The IPBES reports are scientific consensus. They're mainstream. IPBES reports that over 1 million species of plants and animals face extinction unless biodiversity loss at its current rates is halted. Current rates of extinction are tens to hundreds of times higher than the average over the past 10 million years. These extinctions not only put under threat our reliance on currently known contributions from nature, but also threaten the unknown benefits that we're yet to discover. By the time we lose these species, it'll be too late to regain that knowledge. So biodiversity loss is ticking away in the background. A few individuals here, a population there, and many of the benefits of biodiversity are lost well before the final representative of the species dies and extinction is completed. Now, scientists are not robots. Many of us are frustrated, sad, and angry about biodiversity loss because we see our lives and the lives of our families and friends and future generations becoming poorer. So I'm motivated to continue my work on biodiversity, not just because I love nature, but because I care deeply about humans, society, and the continued well-being of future generations. As scientists, our response to biodiversity loss is to gather information and data about what's happening. We document the changes that humans make to ecosystems, how this changes the species that live there, and what the consequences are for nature's contributions to us. And it's also our job to invent solutions. We're very fortunate here in Ireland to have the Biodiversity Data Centre, which is a repository for much of the knowledge that we have about what species occur here, where they are, how many individuals there are, and staff in the Biodiversity Data Centre develop and monitor our national biodiversity indicators. They run very successful citizen science projects and produce practical advice on biodiversity protection, such as the very widely taken up All Ireland Pollinator Plan, and that's been transformative. So what has biodiversity ever done for us? Biodiversity loss and climate change are the key challenges that define our generation, and indeed the generations to come. They're intimately linked to each other. The evolutionary development of life on this planet in all its forms has formed our soils, our atmosphere, and our climate. Our oceans, forests, bogs, grasslands, and oceans currently buffer the climate from the majority of human greenhouse gas emissions by sucking up carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and locking it away in long-term reserves in ocean sediments, in tree trunks, soils, peat, and plant roots. Without the natural world regulating our climate, we would be unable to survive on this planet. At the same time that biodiversity is working really hard for us to regulate our climate by drawing down 60% of the global anthropogenic emissions, we're using these same oceans, bogs, forests, and grasslands to provide us with the food, shelter, medicines that we need to survive. The plants and animals that make up our natural infrastructure clean the water we drink, dispose of our waste, pollinate our crops, among many other services. Ecological processes, the interactions of plants, animals, and fungi and bacteria with each other and with the physical structure of the planet, quietly go on in the background, providing us with these critical services. These ecosystem services are not just about mere human survival, they also make life worth living. Being in nature improves our mental health. It helps us to connect with other people. It provides inspiration and awe, and many of the naturescapes in Ireland are inspiring and particularly beautiful, including many parts of Donegal where we are now. And people come here to experience nature in all of its guises, the wild, the farmed, the gardened, and the constructed or restored. So what are we losing? Here in Ireland, we take advantage of the wealth of nature on our lands and in our rivers, lakes, and oceans to provide for ourselves and also to export for economic gain. We also use resources from all over the world as we buy goods and services that we cannot produce here or which are cheaper and easier to produce elsewhere. So to produce these products and services, we have fundamentally altered most, if not all, habitats on the planet. And these changes are an inevitable consequence of our presence, the number of humans that are here, and the amount of resources that each individual consumes. Our use and consumption of ecosystem goods and services is currently unsustainable. That means that we're degrading the natural capital, the green and blue infrastructure that's needed to ensure the continued supply of food, building materials, medicines, climate and water regulation that we need. We can and must reduce our impact and the impact of our actions on biodiversity in order to provide for our own survival and well-being and to ensure that this wonderful diversity of natural life persists and thrives. So nature in Ireland is in trouble. Over 90% of our protected habitats, such as grasslands and peatlands, are in bad or inadequate condition. Over a quarter of Ireland's breeding birds are declining. 1/3 of Ireland's wild bees are under threat of extinction. These are scary statistics. Globally, the drivers of biodiversity loss have been changes in land and sea use, direct exploitation of organisms through hunting or fishing, for example, climate change, pollution, and invasion of alien species. And these direct drivers are underpinned by human actions, including production and consumption of products and services, and trade and governance. I'm an optimist, but I'm not naive. I know that we cannot turn our landscapes and country back in time to a state where humans, before humans existed. That's just not possible. It's not desirable. We can't erase all of the impacts that we have had, but we do have the knowledge and innovative thinking to determine what our future path is. That path must surely include a commitment to halt biodiversity loss, a commitment to develop new technologies that work with nature, nature-based solutions, not working against nature, in order to provide for our needs. We're not even close to halting biodiversity loss in Ireland. Most of the indicators for biodiversity in our country, a developed and sophisticated nation, are going the wrong way. The National Parks and Wildlife Service is severely underfunded. A recent report on biodiversity financing reports that almost all of the funding for biodiversity conservation in Ireland flows through agri-environment schemes. Ireland spent $1.5 billion on biodiversity from 2010 to 2015, the period covered by the report, and that equates to around 0.13% of our GDP. This needs to be doubled or even tripled in order to get close to halting biodiversity loss. There's a massive gap between the funding that flows to biodiversity conservation in Ireland and what's needed to halt biodiversity loss. We must more effectively use the limited resources that are available. For example, through the better design of agri-environment schemes. We need to increase government funding for this critical public good of biodiversity and find new sources of finance to support our natural infrastructure. There's no shortage of data showing us we have a severe problem, and there's also no shortage of ambitious plans to turn this around. Our most recent Biodiversity Action Plan lists 119 different actions that need to be undertaken across government and civil society in partnership with civil society. Despite the declaration of a biodiversity emergency, we're still lacking serious political and societal will to make the changes that we need to make and implement this plan. We need to move beyond greenwash, platitudes and token efforts in order to make a real difference. There are huge vested interests in business as usual, in agriculture, forestry, turf cutting, trade and consumerism, including our own habits, that obstruct, deny and undermine the problem and our efforts to solve it. On the other hand, we're seeing a rise in individuals and communities taking actions into their own hands, often supported by philanthropic or government incentives, and this gives me hope. The All Ireland Pollinator Plan has been a big success in encouraging people to create more habitats and resources for our threatened pollinator species. And it shows how a conservation initiative can be widely taken up across society and across sectors and lead change, including in Europe. We have the capability to turn around our poor performance on climate change and biodiversity and become global leaders in showing how a society can transition to address the climate and biodiversity emergencies. In many areas, biodiversity climate action and farming or forestry or fisheries can coexist. The recent Mercosur trade deal put beef farmers and environmentalists firmly on the same side in pointing out that importing South American beef is far more environmentally damaging than European and Irish beef. Scientific studies show that beef and dairy products have high carbon footprints and high environmental impacts, but the carbon efficiency and the environmental impacts of production is highly variable between systems. For the climate and for biodiversity, we cannot expand the production and consumption of animal products, but we can certainly do something about how efficiently they are produced. We need to increase the carbon efficiency of our own farming systems and lobby strongly in Europe for higher environmental and carbon emission standards for beef and dairy industries. And we need to pay producers appropriately. We should be putting obstacles, tariffs and taxes in the way of those who produce more environmentally damaging products. Several EU LIFE and European innovation projects in partnership with DAFM are now in operation in Ireland, providing the template for how high nature value farmlands through to intensive dairy farms can enhance biodiversity while still providing food. There's a lot that farmers and scientists together can do to increase the carbon efficiency and biodiversity benefits of Irish agriculture. And I hope that the next CAP, agri-environment subsidies, will incentivise evidence-based results of scientifically supported biodiversity measures rather than token efforts towards low-cost greenwash biodiversity measures. Tourism is one of Ireland's most lucrative industries, and marketing initiatives like the Wild Atlantic Way have increased the number of people enjoying and spending money in our coastal western regions. There are questions around the impact of tourist and sensitive natural habitats, however, with consequent degradation of exactly the landscapes that they've come to see. Marketing initiatives in tourism or agriculture that depend fundamentally on our clean, green image must be designed to prevent environmental damage and deliver supports back to the managers of the natural infrastructure that underpins those industries. There are innovative financial supports available for doing this, such as the European Investment Fund's Natural Capital Financing Facility, which, among other initiatives, funds loans to nature-based businesses, which supports biodiversity conservation and carbon sequestration. Taking advantage of the opportunities for nature conservation will require seed funding. It will require the strengthening of our overstretched and underfunded government agencies and environmental NGOs who have the capacity, if we support them, to deliver good community-based biodiversity projects. What's the future of nature and our own species on this planet? Under the currently projected and indeed likely 1.5 to 2 degrees warming that we're going to see, the majority of terrestrial species ranges are going to shrink dramatically. This will further reduce the space and living capacity of species on the planet, and it will lead to further reductions in biodiversity at local, regional and global levels. 1 in 20 of all species are at risk of climate-related extinction at 2 degrees Celsius. This rises to 1 in 6 species at 4.3 degrees of warming. Tropical coral reefs will decline to less than 1% of their former cover at 2 degrees warming. These are some of the most spectacular and biodiverse ecosystems in the world. Think about the Great Barrier Reef, for example. And the ecosystem services provided by living, functional tropical coral reefs will be almost completely destroyed at 2°C warming. We don't know yet how big an impact the extinction of 5 to 16% of all species on the planet will have on our ecosystem services and our life support systems. It will depend on what species go extinct and where and when. But we do know that ecosystem services will likely be affected long before the last individual dies out and extinction happens. For example, a reduction in sphagnum moss cover in bogs would reduce the quantity of carbon that can be sequestered in these systems. Loss of pollinators will reduce the quantity and quality of insect-pollinated crops like oilseed rape, strawberries, apples, and the important things like coffee and chocolate. Some losses will be substitutable. Perhaps the services of one pollinator can substitute for another, but others will be irreplaceable. In order to reduce the impacts of climate change on biodiversity, we need to fix the other drivers of biodiversity loss so that species can be more resilient to climate change effects. And this is why I called for the National Biodiversity Action Plan to be fully implemented as a key action in Ireland's climate change adaptation strategy. Large, healthy and connected populations of species will be better able to resist and adapt to climate change, and small, isolated and exposed populations will be at high risk of extinction. So the IPBES report calls for transformative change in order to achieve the UN Sustainable Development Goals while protecting nature. This would involve significant structural change, which must be achieved despite the opposition of powerful vested interests. The IPBES report also encourages us to reimagine what a good quality of life looks like, one that does not entail ever-increasing consumerism, one that works with nature rather than against it, one where biodiversity and climate action is mainstreamed throughout all of our decision-making. I want a future for myself and my children where we have healthy food produced on farms that protect and use nature sustainably, a future where technology is designed to have low environmental impact, where technology makes it easy for us to do the right thing. A future with meaningful work, a connected society, and where I can listen to the buzz of bees, the chirping of birds, feel the grass under my feet, and smell the flowers. We have an opportunity with the Citizens' Assembly on Biodiversity to have a national conversation about what biodiversity and its loss means to us here in Ireland, and what we stand to gain by halting and then reversing biodiversity loss. It would be an opportunity to acknowledge our shared heritage and identity and construct a vision for our country that would improve the environment and biodiversity for the next generation. The challenge lies not in delivering this reimagined future to the few who may be able to afford it, but in delivering it equitably to the many who deserve the opportunity for a comfortable and meaningful life. Thank you very much.